What's going on, guys? In this video we'll be discussing the basics of logging, and this video or mini-series will be aimed at beginners. So we'll cover what exactly logging is, what the point is, and why we should use logging and how it can help, as well as some of the functionality of logging, some of the configurations, and depending on how I feel, I'll try to cover the more advanced topics as well. So we'll be covering a lot of the logging stuff, and the log module is actually really big, so I won't be able to cover all of it. Alright, so with that said, let's just talk about what logging is and what it can do. Logging basically allows you to document the flow of your program by having logging statements inserted at various parts of your program and having that information from those logging statements either directed to your console or log files. So basically these statements allow you to debug your program on a higher level and help you catch bugs that are not caught by the compiler or at runtime. And not only does it help you debug your program, it's also helpful to keep records. So if you are, say, a bank and you need to keep records of the transactions occurring, or say you're a web service and you want to make sure that your website is working efficiently, you can actually keep records of this with your logging statements and then pour over your logging statements and see where there are inefficiencies or potential attacks from certain locations. So with logging, you can sort of see how your program is working and basically gather a lot of information regarding your program. Now, in this series, we'll basically focus on debugging and just trying to make sure our programs are working correctly. So we'll be using logging and placing them in various places just to make sure that our program is working as intended and just to have statements that we can pour over and look for any potential bugs. So logging actually is one form of debugging. You guys probably have used or use print statements to debug as well. Now, print statements are fine, but it can get a little messy as your programs get bigger and bigger. And the problem with print statements is that they're not as flexible. So the first thing is, say you have like 30 print statements printed out throughout your program. After you're done, you might have to remove a lot of those print statements. Especially if you're trying to debug and you're trying to find the source of the error, you might have print statements or extra print statements inserted, and then after you're done, trying to remove all of them can be a nightmare. Not only that, with print statements, you don't have flexibility of sending those print statements in multiple places at the same time as you do with logging. So logging will allow you more flexibility. I can send information to SD out as well as 4 different log files at the same time pretty efficiently, as opposed to print statements. You won't have as much flexibility as you do with logging a module. Now, there are also other benefits with logging in terms of filtering of types of messages, and we'll cover all that as well. So let's just jump into the basics. So you'll see in the first cell that we have imported logging, and then we're going to be calling various different methods. Now, these methods are actually filter levels. So they represent a type of message characterizing critical levels. So we'll see debug, info, warning, error, critical. And basically, debug is the lowest critical level or the lowest importance level, and critical is of the highest importance. So with logging.debug, this is a debug message. Basically, we're characterizing this message. This is a debug message, or setting the level to the level of debug. And then with critical, we're setting that level. This is a critical message, logging.critical. We're setting that message to the level of critical. And with logging, you can filter out the critical levels, so you'll get only the messages from X level to above. So what I mean by that is, say right now we import logging and our level is at warning. So if our level is at warning, what happens is when we run our script, all of the logging messages that are of level debug and info are going to be ignored. And only the logging messages of warning and above are going to be either printed to your SD out or SD error or your log files, depending on where you are directing your logging information. So even if I have, say, 200 log statements and 199 of them are debug and info, if I set a logging.warning, or if I set the level to logging.warning, only the last message will be displayed. So this is the flexibility that you have over print statements. You could give levels of importance to each logging statement, as opposed to print statement, everything is on the same level. So in our cell here, we actually have one statement for each level. Now what you're going to see is I haven't set any levels here because by default when you import logging, if you don't set any levels and you run a logging statement such as logging.debug or logging.info, the level will automatically be set to warning. So once again, this is an important point. If I don't explicitly set my logging level, whenever I run any logging statement such as debug, info, warning, error critical, or any other logging statements, the level will automatically be set to warning. So that's going to be the default level. And now, as I said earlier, the way that logging works is that if my level is set to, say, level warning, anything above in terms of importance will only be displayed. So anything with a warning and above will only be displayed. So we have warning, error, critical. And the first two, debug and info, which are critical levels below warning, will not be displayed. So let me just run this and show you guys exactly what's going to happen. So in this case, we only have warning, critical, and error. Warning, error, critical displayed. And this is because, like I said, if we don't explicitly set our logging critical level, it will default to warning. And that's what happened in this case. Alright, so what do we see? Logging messages also have a default format, and the format is level, name, and message. So the warning, error, and critical are the levels. So this is the default sort of format for the messages that will be displayed. And warning, once again, is the level. So we have warning, then root is the name, and this is a warning message, is just the message that we want to display. Now root is actually the logger object, and it's the default logger object. Now with logging, we can create multiple logger objects with different levels and different formats, but for this video, for simplicity's sake, I'm going to just work with the root logger. So the root logger is the default logger. If you don't explicitly create any loggers, you will automatically work with the root logger. Now the root logger is the base logger, and any other loggers you create are created as children of the root logger. So it's sort of this hierarchical model where every new logger you create will be a child of the root logger. And you can configure the child as you like, but if you forget to do any configuration, it will absorb the configurations of the root logger. So those are some details we'll, I guess, look into the subsequent videos, but for right now, let's just understand that we're dealing with the root logger because we didn't explicitly create any other loggers. Now the first thing I want you guys to notice is the levels. I'm going to scroll down a little bit. Each level, critical, error, warning, info, debug, is actually represented by numbers behind the scenes. So debug is actually 10, info is 20, warning is 30, error is 40, and critical is 50. And you could actually create your own levels, say 60, 70, or even, I guess, 5 under debug. But the default levels are as shown here. This was copy and pasted from the docs, so if you guys want a better look, here it is. So this is the level and numeric value. Now, one thing I want you guys to be aware of is that when you're working with the root logger, and in this case, we start off with the default value of the warning level. Now what happens is, once the warning level is set, so in this case, we didn't explicitly set a warning level, or we didn't configure anything about the root logger, what happens is, once you run the first statement, the configurations take place. So once I ran this cell and the first line, which is logging.debug, configuration takes place, and you cannot make any more changes to the root logger. Now to make actual changes to the configuration, you have to explicitly access the root object or the root logger and make changes to that. Now, if that was slightly confusing, don't worry too much about it. I will show you as we go to the next cell. Alright, so this is how you make basic configurations to your root logger. So you have logging.basicconfig. Here you can set the level, and you could also set the format, among other things, which I'll show you in the subsequent cells. However, this statement can only be ran once, and once the format options have been set, you can't change it until you reset or restart your Python script. So if I go above, you'll see that I have actually ran this cell, and I told you that when we run a cell, or we run a logging statement such as logging.debug, what happens in the back is that the configuration gets all set up. So the configuration runs in the background. So here we're actually explicitly calling it, But here, we didn't explicitly call it, so all of the configuration happens in the background. So the root logger gets configured. So let me show you that so you guys get a better understanding. Alright, so I'm going to try to run this now. And what I'm trying to do is run logging.basicconfig and try to change the logging level to debug. Alright, so we don't need that logging statement, so I edited it out. But here I'm trying to change the basic logging level to debug and then run this. Now you'll see that it didn't actually change the logging level. We still have a logging level of warning. And this is because, like I said earlier, the logging.basicconfig can only be ran once or configured once. So earlier, when we ran this, we didn't explicitly call basicconfig, so that basicconfig was ran in the background and it automatically used the default settings. So here, we still have the default settings despite explicitly calling basicconfig. Now what I'm going to do is we can restart and clear output. Alright, so now that it's cleared, what I'll do is I'll actually run this first. And you'll see, oops, let me uncomment this because we need to import logging. But I'll run this and you'll see now we're actually able to set the level to logging.debug. And here we're able to get all 5. As opposed to earlier, we're only able to get logging.warning error critical because the default level is warning. So this is one of the drawbacks of working with the root logger. Most of the times when you see logging within Python scripts or Python projects, they'll create explicitly child loggers so that it is actually easier to follow and they can have more configurations or more flexibility as to how to format the levels as well as the statements that's going to be outputted by the logger. So that's one thing you need to be careful of. This thing can only be called once. Now if I go back up here and I run this, you'll see it's printing out all the statements because we've already configured the logger to be level equals logging.debug. Now, there is a way, as I said, if you want to actually change the level of the root logger, you have to actually access the root logger itself. So you can actually make some changes to this basic config, but you can't use this basic config wrapper. So let me show you what I mean. Alright, so here what I'm going to do is logging.root. So I'm accessing the root logger and then set level to logging critical. So this is one way you could change the root level. Logging.root.setLevel logging.critical. Okay, now that I've ran this, if I run this, you'll see that only the critical statement is outputted. This is because I was able to access the root logger and change the level. As opposed to here, which is more of a wrapper, you could only run it once. So as you can see here, when I ran this cell block, this was sort of ignored because it's already been configured once and it could only be configured once each time you run your Python script. Alright, so that was basically just a quick introduction to the different levels of logging and some of the things you have to be careful of. Now, you might be wondering why logging is set up the way it is. Why can't you just filter for debug or filter for info instead of filtering for anything above info? There is actually a way to filter for specific severity levels. The thinking behind logging is that they don't want you to miss the error critical and sort of the higher level stuff. So if you're only outputting info and there's still warning or critical errors within your code, they don't want you to miss that due to your logging level being to info. So basically, when you run info, if you have any critical errors, they will be displayed because it's a good safety precaution. Alright, now with that said, let's look at how to actually turn off logging in a slightly hackish way. So here what I can do is, as you can see, all levels are going from 0 to 50. And if I wanted to turn off all of logging, all I need to do is logging.root.setLevel to 60. So if I set the level to 60, only 60 and higher critical levels will be displayed. But in the default logging system, only levels from 0 to 50 are available. So this will be a slightly hackish way to turn off all of your logging. So as you can see, nothing is getting displayed. And if I turn this to 10, which is debug, all of the messages should be displayed, as you can see here. And now just to get the level of where you're at, so logging.root.getEffectiveLevel will tell you what your current level is. So we just set it to 10, so our level should be 10. Or we get back the value 10. All right, so that was some of the sort of gotchas or things you have to be careful of when dealing with logging, and a quick introduction to loggers and the root object. In the subsequent video, we will learn how to create multiple loggers that are children of the root logger, and that will allow for more flexibility. So currently, we were just outputting the loggers to stdout or standard out or our shell. Now, sometimes we want to be able to write to log files, and this is what I'll show you in this cell. So the way to write to log files is basically within the logging.basic config. So here we set our file name attribute or parameter to the name of the file that we want to output it to. Now, since we could only run logging.basic config once, all of our output will only go to this file name. And once again, don't worry about that. I'll teach you in the subsequent video how to output your logs to multiple files. So this logging.basic config is not the way most people use logging. They actually create multiple logger objects, and I'm just using it in this video for simplicity's sake. So this will be the basic config, and everything will go to example.log. And our level is going to be logging.debug. Now let me show you first. Actually, let me just run this. The reason why it's being displayed as it is because I need to restart the kernel. And this is because we've already ran the basic config. I need to run the basic config again. So here we go. So I've ran this file, and as you can see, nothing is being outputted. This is because we want our output to go to example.log. So let's just go to example.log. Let me show you properties. So example.log. And we have the 3 print statements because our set level was debug. Now, in this next cell, I'll show you some more configurations. And once again, it's a little annoying, but I have to just restart this. So here, in the basic config, we're going to be outputting everything to example.log. But we can also have a file mode. Now, the file mode is default to append. So anytime you run a cell or save a log statement to a file, it's going to continue to append to that file. Now, you could change the file mode by using the file mode parameter. And now we also have format. And this is the format of our messages. So first, we want to have a name, which is the name of the logger. And in this case, the name of our logger is root because we haven't created any additional loggers. So we'll have the name, and then we'll have the level name and message. Now this is just an old way of string formatting. I think the code was copied straight from Java, and that's why they haven't updated the old string formatting to some of the newer methods in Python. So that's why it looks a little weird. But basically, this S represents string, and the name is basically one of the special keywords or variables within the logging format that you can use. And there's actually a list in the docs of the different logging string variables you can use when formatting. So this name is just the name of the object. The level name is the level name, which is root, warning, critical, etc. And the message is just the message. So here we've formatted our message to be displayed as such. And this is the default format method. So we have append and we have example.log. So I'll run this. So I need to import logging, which I forgot to do here. Alright, so I'll run this again. And if we look at the folder, you'll see we have example2, and we have root, warning, logging with special format. So root is the name, the warning is the level, and this is the message. Alright, if we go back here, you'll see, if we look at the cell again, we'll see that example2log, and the format is name, level name, message, and this was our message, logging with special format. Alright. Now, once again, I'll just clear everything. And now I'll show you that there are various different formats you can use. Here, our format will be process, which is the process ID of the Python program, the level name, and message. So logging with process format. If I run this, you'll see this is the process ID, the warning, which is the level name, and the message, logging with process format. And I have one more configuration using datetime. Now you could also use datetime, which I think is probably one of the most useful formats because you want to log the time and the date where certain events occurred. So here the format is ASCII time. I think that's ASCII time. Anyway, message. And here's how you are formatting the time. So this is a month, day, year. I forget the I should be hours. Okay, yeah. So the I is hours, minutes, seconds, and P is either PM or AM. All right, so I'll run this and you'll see. So we have the date, we have the time, and we have the message. Now, if you want to take a look at all of the formatting options or the formatting variables or attributes, you can look at the docs, and I've linked everything. So these are all the sort of formatting or args that you can use. Time, when it was created, file name, func, blah, blah, blah. So there's a lot of different variables or arguments you can use. All right. Now this video is getting a little longer than expected, so I will try to rush a little bit through the next two parts. Okay. Now one thing you have to be careful is that logging does not work in print. It doesn't work like print. So above, if we go above here, you see these statements here, these string statements. So logging does not work like print in the sense that you can't break them up. So let me scroll back down. Now with print, you can sort of break up your string into smaller parts. So addition of x and y produces x plus y. So with logging, you can't do that. So I'll run this, and you'll see this huge error, which you don't need to go through. But basically, this message is saying that you can't break up your string into parts like you do with the print statement. Now if I run this with formatting, string formatting, and I'm kind of sure you can use f-string as well, but if you break it up into 0, 1, 2 and use string formatting, then logging has no problem understanding that format. So here we go. So we're able to use string formatting and print out a nice string. Okay. Now you can also log your exceptions. So here we're importing logging. We have A and B equals 99, 199, and all we're going to do is try to assert. And if it doesn't assert, we're going to have an accept statement, so try accept, and log the info from that accept statement. So all we need to do is exception info equals true, and if we run this, you'll see we log the entire trace back. So this is also a good way of debugging. Alright, so that was video number 1. Might have gone a little longer than expected, but this was just the basic intro to logging. In the next video, I want to go over some of the handlers you can create, as well as how to create multiple logger objects. So we'll look at that in the next video.